Hi, welcome to the XY Chromies, Confidently Uncertain, a show where two Army vets turned renewable energy engineers talk Army issues, veteran issues, geopolitics, engineering, science, and everything in between. I'm your host, Pearson Guest, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ellis. How's it going today, Richard?
Good to talk to you, Pearson. The foretold weather change has happened. It's raining cats and dogs outside.
Yes, and in lieu of that, I'm in a new location over here. I've made it to Curtainville, USA. Um, it's nice and blue to signify the rain, I guess. Um, no, Richard and I are trying a new location out due to recent internet latency issues, and we are just trying everything we can to keep the video part alive here because we don't want to rob our 10 viewers of our lovely faces. So,
Oh, and I just got a haircut, so you're welcome, viewers.
heck yeah, that's right. Keep it tight. I say with my long locks over here. So, what did we talk about last week, Richard? I think we talked about quite a few things. World War related, I think definitely came up. Poland was a conversation. I started off with a story about Poland, and we talked in and out about some various issues with Russian meddling, I think.
Yeah, and we got into the topic of the Battle of Stalingrad as a way to kind of, um, as Sarah Payne might say, play full court tennis, where we're trying to get in the minds of the generations of leadership that have shaped the modern day Russian state, and why a war of adventure in Ukraine or meddling in the affairs of Poland completely fits a existential strategy by the Russian Federation that's existed since the beginning of the 20th century.
That's right. That's great. So that it's so many good segues just happened for us to go kind of right back into this whole
Mm-hmm.
sphere of talk because I think I mean it's very appropriate. We're in a Cold War state right now.
Mm-hmm.
The geopolitical winds are very much shifting right now. U.S. leadership has indicated that they would like to try and shore up an alliance with our enemies and
Mm-hmm.
distance ourselves from our allies while also plunging the global economy into a recession, it seems. Very,
Mm-hmm.
very ad hoc. This is similar to the America First movement in the 1920s. That's what it was called for anybody. You guys can look it up. And it was Smoot and Hawley were the big proponents of that. So why this is important? So a couple things I had discussions with my wife about recently were the differences in Russia's tactics with propaganda and misinformation and finding willing agents and finding, cultivating, or implanting insurgents within the U.S. or the Western sphere of influence through spycraft and what's known as the FSB now was the KGB and these intelligence agencies within Russia. What I proposed to my wife, Sarah, was the game has changed in how Russia's approaching getting agents necessarily to exploit. Previously, the idea was finding someone who is financially unstable or vulnerable. Potentially, they could work for the government already, right? Um, and you could exploit them or supplant them early on. They would start agents off very early. Russia was is very good at starting getting agents in early, at like the FBI, famously, or even the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
They did this and using fear and other means to coerce people to do the bidding of the U.S., do the bidding of Russia within the U.S. or the West in general. And what's striking now is instead, I feel like Putin, who truly is a master of Western psychology, you know, understands that finding individuals who are wealthy already or perfectly or powerful, but have complete self-serving interest in mind,
Hmm.
as someone that they can actually, facilitate instead. And what I mean, like Trump is a perfect example of someone who, you know, I don't think he's getting directives from Russia to do their bidding necessarily. Like I don't think Putin's like, hey, say this, do these. I think he generally just needs to support Trump, and Trump will do the destruction for them, right? And similarly, Elon Musk is like somebody that Russia would love to support. I don't think Elon is colluding with the Russians necessarily, but Elon is trying to take all the power, and so it still to take all the power in the U.S. Elon has to distance the U.S. from our allies because our allies are there to keep us hold us accountable, really. At the end of the day, if you think of NATO or the UN, these bilateral agreements or relationships, these are they make us a type of family or a community, right? This is a way of countries forming a type of community and finding shared values, whether they be economic or social or moral values, across different countries. For you to isolate to consolidate power within a country, you have to isolate from those checks and balances that your friends or family would keep an eye on you. That's kind of how this looks. Um, so, anyways, I kind of rambled on the end there, but the idea is that Russia has changed how they go about things. They realize they can find greedy people in America or in the West and just send boatloads of money, and they will easily. There's no patriotism here, right? There's no loyalty to the country at all for Tucker Carlson's say, right? We know he's been bought and paid by the Russians just because everything he says is so clearly Russian propaganda. Um, and Tim Pool and all these other online figures now will very easily sell out the country for a buck. So that's the tactic now that Russia's really gone about. Probably more successfully than we ever have at breaking up democracies potentially. like, um,
It's the overt it is the overt part of the tactic that we can see. There's sort of iceberg geometry here where we
yeah,
can see a tip of it, and there's a lot of it that's under the water that we just haven't even fathomed yet.
yeah. I so go ahead. Sorry.
So one of the things I this is not going to be a screed on the corruption of the West, but there is a generational erosion of what it means to um, have a sense of national culture or national patriotism in America. And part of that erosion is just it's a consequence of like just a few things kind of working in synergy. And one of them is that if you actually if you actually want to be a person who knows what's going on, if you want to be like knowledgeable of history and current events of this nation, then the very investigation of that can leave you feeling a little bit cynical about our country's dubious past. Because we have an original sin of slavery, we have the genocide of native peoples, we have these wars of adventure with our neighbors. So we have all these different things that we can point to and say, "Oh, this country's problematic."
Yeah,
Howard Zinn would tell you that it's been a class and labor war since the very beginning in the people's history of the United States. So if you start looking at this country with a critical eye, you can very quickly become cynical and not care to invest in its potential future, or that you can see that really the only right thing to do is to let it crumble into pieces and fall apart. So that's one dynamic that you could is kind of working here. You have the others that are greed. So um, I can never remember exactly how to quote it. I just haven't committed it to memory yet. If you ever get a chance to read uh, Slaughterhouse Five by Kurt Vonnegut,
Yeah, of
there's
course.
this there's this quote in the book by a fictional character about how America hates its poor, and this is hyperbolic. It's a fictional book. Kurt Vonnegut is writing a fictional story about real events, and so he kind of he's figured out how to create a propagandist in the story who is from America, who was formerly an American citizen who defected to Nazi Germany. And it's this guy who's quoting, who I would be quoting here if I could remember it. But he just talks about how the this country despises its poor people. And so we have this sort of inward hatred of anything about our national culture that is anything other than opulence or um, captain of industry, right? And I think I have probably another couple, but I want you to comment on the first two if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah. So I completely agree. What I think it takes it a step further is the poor people hate the poor
Yep.
too. Like especially, right?
Yes.
Like there's
Yes.
this
Yes.
the funny thing is like it kind of reminds me of a Chris Rock joke. It's completely like racially charged joke. They joke about it in The Office because it drops about a crap ton of in bombs like Michael Scott does in The Office for this joke. But Chris Rock is talking about two types of black people, and this is a joke that he was telling back, I think, in the late '80s or early '90s, sometime early on, right? And this one was killing. And the idea was that like there's the ghetto black people. That's not what he's saying. He's saying the N word hard with
Right.
and then there's not, and how the normal like middle class black community hates the ghetto black community because they make them look bad kind of situation here. So what this reminds me of is like, but similarly like poors, like rich people hate poors in America, but poor people you hate the people around you, and it makes sense, right? Like if the poor people around you are most likely they have hard socioeconomic status, which puts pressure on the family dynamic in some way, typically, right? Lack of a parent, if not two parents, drug abuse, abuse in general, due to financial strain, which is, I mean, look, everyone in the world understands that nothing puts more stress really on a relationship most of the time than financial strain. And this is
Mm-hmm.
just, it's generally universal. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Rich people might not even understand this, but definitely poor people understand. Um, like poor people think about money way more than rich people, right? But rich people think about money a lot. It's just poor people are thinking about like the negatives of the effects of not having money all
Right.
the time, right? Um, which causes you to live. This triggers our fear responses. So that's one thing. So Kurt Vonnegut was definitely onto something. I think that's fascinating is that poor people hate poor people.
This is a snippet from Howard W. Campbell Jr., the character in the book.
Mm-hmm.
It is, in fact, a crime for an American to be poor, even though America is a nation of poor. That's his, like one
Yeah,
sentence out of his entire
nailed it.
solo.
That's it right there.
Yep. And I the book is just an interesting read, just because Kurt Vonnegut is an interesting author and
Yeah.
what he writes and says is
Slaughterhouse
interesting.
Five was a very impactful book in my teenage years. I would have to
Mhm.
revisit it to really refresh my memory. It was definitely 1984 vibes. What's that? Who wrote that one? Who wrote 1984? Was that Kurt Vonnegut too? No, that was.
Yeah.
Um,
I have the internet right in front of me. Why don't I just look it up?
yeah, look that up.
I of course I know the answer.
I know his name too. I just am like totally fudging on it right now. Sorry, everybody. 1984.
George Orwell.
Orwell, the
Yeah.
Orwellian. Yeah, of
So
course.
that's the problem when you're such a when an author becomes so incredibly integrated into your culture, their name disappears and you just remember everything about the aura.
Well, yeah, and I mean, their name has turned into adjectives to
Yeah.
describe things.
Yeah.
Orwellian, right? It
Mm-hmm.
describes a dystopian type of future that he lays
Yeah.
out. So, I the funny thing is, we quote about this stuff. We've seen so Dr. Casagrande, I don't know, have you seen the series where he says how we got here series? It's really, I
I
mean,
I haven't looked at it yet.
so
It's in my queue.
yeah, that he really lays out an interesting story about. He doesn't talk about the amount of good faith that the U.S. gained after World War II within itself, within the
Right.
national pride, like all of that stuff. He doesn't really mention that. He kind of talks around World War II and stuff, but
Mm-hmm.
he really focuses his in on the last 40 years of American history because he's like, how did we
Mm-hmm.
get here? Like, what are these things? And he lays out this really interesting scenario. He talks about a couple different countries, events in different countries that shaped other things, things that we got involved in other countries. But the general, if I was like to distill it down into this idea, he hones in on a lot of instances where the U.S. starts to erode that good faith. The our politicians, through decisions that they made, through actions, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
through crisis and situations that they couldn't even control or they tried to control, started to erode the public's faith in it
Yep.
through these specific instances. And there are these really monumental instances that generally started to spark this feeling of distrust. And distrust in government is baked into our country,
Right.
right? It's part of the culture. So, but we do go through periods like everything else of national pride and
Mm-hmm.
accomplishment, things that we've done well, we'll ride on these. Like World War One, generally we come out looking like the good guys who rescued the day.
Yep.
The French and the British wanted to fight the Germans during World War One. Everybody wanted to fight. There were no good guys in World War One. The U.S.
Yeah.
was like the
Totally.
least bad of the actors. That's really what I mean. If you look at World War One, the U.S. was like generally like, nah, not that bad, right? Comparatively to everyone else who was pretty bad. The Brits wanted to defeat Germany. They were worried Germany was a new empire that was very dangerous. They were
Yep.
terrified.
Yep.
Kaiser, he was looking to stretch his wings, as we've discussed in a couple episodes. He was
Mm-hmm.
ready to fly. It's in
Mm-hmm.
the name. Kaiser is
Mm-hmm.
what German's word for Caesar, right? That's how
Yes.
they pronounce Caesar, Kaiser. Um, the Persians, by the way, pronounce it Caesar. Caesar, by the way. Anyways, funny. Um, oh, by the way, interesting factoid. There are two Aryan races. Everyone should know. Lesson one, it's not the Germans. They did try to steal it, but Aryan, Iran means Aryan. That's what Iran means. Literally, it's in the name, by the way. There's also another one. You're Aryan, by the way. You're very Aryan, and I'm very Aryan.
Mm-hmm.
Irish is
Mm-hmm.
where
Mm-hmm.
Aryan comes from as well. Very old English. That's where Arya comes from. Arya is also a word in Ireland and in Iran, funny enough. Ryan comes from Aryan, Ryan, Rian. Anyways, that means like chief, noble. Aryan just means chief or noble. Like that's all it means. Noble people. That's it. So, anyways, fun little factoid. So, um, random, but anyways, we're talking about history. We're talking about all this stuff. There you go. So there were no good guys during World War One, but we came out with a lot of goodwill, and soon after, it took about 10 to 15 years of Republican control to erode that goodwill. And I'm going to just start calling it what it is. And I used to be a Republican in the past, but when I start to look at the lens of how it's laid out, and we see that, um, Lyndon Johnson is negotiating a peace deal for us to get out of Vietnam. And it turns out Nixon pays a shit ton of money to the Vietnamese president to tell him to stall it. No, I don't. Don't have a peace. Keep the war going, and then we'll stop it once I'm president. Well, Nixon did stop the war, but 7 years later, 2 terms later, 2 or 3 million Vietnamese later, dead. 40,000 more U.S. soldiers dead. Whoever knows how much trauma and PTSD and homelessness he laid upon the American population of young soldiers.
If I can interject,
absolutely,
our opiate epidemic comes from the time of Vietnam. Opioids had always been a part of our
it supercharged it for sure.
It's our history, but our modern opium epidemic comes from the Vietnam War. Please proceed.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. That's true. And then so this, Nixon breaks trust twice. He cheats in both elections. The first one, most people don't know about, but he cheats to win, and he wins. By the way, he obviously wins. The reason Nixon is such a paranoid alcoholic, frankly, he's probably drinking because he's so stressed, was he was so concerned that people would find out he cheated in the first one. That's why he cheated the second time. He was so worried. I mean, they were destroying government documents. He was worried that, the Democrats, if they took over, if they won, they would find out, because everyone knew. Lyndon B. Johnson knew. He was talking about having Nixon shot. We know this for a fact. There's live recording of Lyndon B. Johnson cursing at Nixon and calling him a traitor and saying he should be shot. And the only reason he did it is because Nixon was popular in that election and he won. And, we were worried about how the people would perceive these things. And this seems to be a common trend also. So this was one. I'll get through these quick so you can get in here. The other one was Reagan colluding with the Iranians to not release the hostages for Jimmy Carter until after the election, until after he was inaugurated. And he gave a couple boatloads of money to Mossad, the prime minister at the time, where he's like, hey, could you convince those students to not release the hostages yet? I'm sure Mossad was like, hey, here's some gold bars or whatever the hell was in those briefcases. And Reagan won the election because he was concerned. And I'm messing up the presidents right now. Who am I messing up? Oh, yeah. So Nixon was, so that Walter, the vice president of Lyndon B. Johnson, wouldn't become the president. That was for him. Reagan did this to stop Carter from winning a second term. And then we have George Bush Jr., who, all the gazillions of voting irregularities in Florida. People don't remember this. The Supreme Court won this one for him by saying we can't do a recount because who will pay for it? Not like Florida, because they messed up so much. They're not going to pay for it or make the candidates pay for it. It's an election. This stuff kind of matters, but no. So George Bush cheated and successfully pulled it off. There were a lot of voting irregularities in the second Bush election, but no one cared about that because it was in the second term. And then Trump. So we don't need to go over those. If you're listening to us, you're probably pretty aware of all the cheating that's happened, and most certainly the cheating that's definitely happened this last election with Elon Musk using Twitter as a weapon against the public. Specifically in Pennsylvania, it looks like Twitter was doing everything in its power to suppress Democratic shit and propel far-right stuff. So these things have eroded the trust. I mean, we had these issues. We had 2008, the Tea Party movement, the Occupy Wall Street, and the whole time, these last 40, 50 years of presidents doing these shenanigans, eroding the trust in our people. Three Mile Island, right? Things like this, these big public things. Oh, there's no radiation there. Oh, turns out there is radiation. All this stuff. You get a lot of erosion of trust. And meanwhile, the whole time, you've got Reagan and the Bushes and Nixon selling our country out to the highest bidder, to our workforce out to the highest bidder, trying to keep our labor population poor
Mm-hmm.
and uneducated and hungry.
Mm-hmm.
You have Wall Street gutting pensions. Pensions disappear in the 80s and 90s, right? Pensions go away. Labor unions get destroyed in the 80s and 90s. And it paints a picture of complete lack of trust in the system. And when you have one party working against the other to destroy it, and they think it's a zero-sum game, they've basically said, like, it's become existential, and they made it that way. If you're trying to build something forward, if you're trying to build anything, it's nearly impossible if every 4 years or 8 years they're going to undo it. Or they're going to create problems that end up being in your lap every time you take control.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny that we talked about centuries and repeating themselves, and maybe we should
Mm-hmm.
analyze in a different way. If you look at the 60s through till Woodrow Wilson, and if Woodrow Wilson's just a blip of Democratic normalism in a
Right.
sea of Republican do-nothings, that whole 50-year period is basically Republican ran 50 years, a half century. That happens after the Civil War. Did I say world? I meant Civil War. If you look after the Civil War, you have probably some of the least inactivity of presidents, period, because everyone was so afraid of everything, which is why Jim Crow was on the rise and deregulation happened for so long. Standard and Oil becomes Standard and Oil because of this. Carnegie becomes Carnegie before. And then you finally get a strong Republican like Roosevelt. He comes along. Might as well, he would have been looked at as a modern day Democrat now. I mean, if you look at Teddy Roosevelt, saving a bunch of public land and shit and doing all that, going after big companies and antitrust shit. So you get this really long period of cynically running the country, I would say, and which causes the next half of the century to kind of have to be the shining light of fixing stuff generally, right? And we see this with FDR onward through Truman, Truman was actually incredible what he was able to do. We've talked about him,
Mm-hmm.
probably not enough. Truman could have tried to overthrow Iran, by the way. He said no, unlike Eisenhower, who was like, oh, they're trying to democratize? Fuck that. So, yeah, if I look at if I look at our lifespans and who's ran the country, what's interesting in the last 50 years, it's just generally been a moderate central leader besides Trump, I'd say, I guess, or whatever. But you just generally have like barely a Democrat or barely a Republican running the middle of the country, in a way that there's not a lot to hang our hats on, which is crazy. I've been rambling for a while, so I'll let you chime in and say things.
Your point is well taken on this side of the screen, and one of the in my short series of reasons why the American public would have uh, mistrust in our systems and our institutions and in just about everything that if you try to preserve some of the best qualities of our nation, those lesser qualities come along with it, and
Mm-hmm.
this is kind of I feel like the central thesis of where we're kind of getting to today. Um, we when you brought up the Vietnam War, it's almost like you can't say enough about that period of our history having um, the amount of impact that you can't say enough about the impact the Vietnam War had on our present times and going forward. It's just incredible. And um, you could look at it from any slice of the apple. You could look at it from the problem of it being a war of adventure and ostensibly being a war about communism versus Americanism. That's a what the hell is Americanism, right? That's not just democracy. It's about this um, uh, free market capital approach to a world order, but really misguided in its application. You can look
Also,
at it
I heard
from
Eisenhower wasn't a big fan of the British um, Empire or the French Empire. Eisenhower, so funny enough, I've learned this recently.
yeah.
Eisenhower thought that imperialism was a lot to blame, for World War II.
Yes.
He wasn't looking at the financial elements, but he was just looking at the imperial side of things. And he had identified the French Empire was a problem, and he thought they were a
Yes.
destructive force on the world. And Vietnam was there was a lot. The funny thing is when we talk and we distill some in the history books, sometimes you got to go through history. It's that
Yeah.
day they're teaching the Vietnam War and they've moved on, right? And
Yeah.
it's really
Yeah. Yeah.
tragic. The idea is that they're hoping that as students will, hey, if you find something interesting, read more on it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Vietnam, was all fighting against communism, Western ideology, democracy against communism was the reason the history book said. But there were a ton of other reasons of why wars are fought, right? Daniel Spaniel, Lines on Maps guy, he talks about conditions for war. War is what happens when you've found a place where you can no longer negotiate through economic or geopolitical means, right? It's a different form of negotiating geopolitically. A lot of times, that's what wars are.
Diplomacy by any other means.
Yeah,
So, the Vietnam War era, that is to say, the 10 years or so that we would think of as being the really active period. It was actually a much longer period of time.
yes,
Um, you have a generation of people being marched into a meat grinder. So you have the impact on veterans and how veterans reflect back on their country. So that there's a non-zero consequence there. You have the protests. So the people that were on American soil looking at this as a problem, having very little idea of what they were actually protesting, except that there was a war going on and they wanted it to end. So you have that going on. You have the impact of race relations occurring at the same time, and those are blended into the stresses of the war.
yeah.
And I'm running out of steam of the different things I could bring up to point at. It's a gem of many facets, and it has such a profound impact on how we think and do business and interact with each other even to this day.
So there's a lot of things that are happening during the Vietnam era
Mm-hmm.
around the globe as well that we were responsible for. I mean, if you think about it, this is the era where, Kissinger
Mm-hmm.
is basically his position is he's running he's running the country in a way. He's running foreign policy, but his foreign policy ideology was chaos so that
Mm-hmm.
we can exploit. I mean, that was like his personal. I think he wrote about it in his freaking book. That's a highly destructive. I mean, for a country that has created NATO and the United Nations and a bunch of things to bring the world together into this
Yeah.
global order, having someone take over foreign policy for 8 years through Nixon administration. Nixon's drunk and belligerent anyway, so he's just letting Kissinger's stopping Nixon from starting World War III, but at the same time, Kissinger's also like, because World War III is bad for markets, but Kissinger is like, he's a capitalist, and he's like, what's best for the American markets is
Right.
small amounts of little chaos that, will keep people distracted from democratizing and figuring out that we're exploiting them for their resources, right? Like if there's a democracy forming, which is, like if you think, oh, we're the democratic country and we're trying to create democracies everywhere. Well, Well, that was the Truman era, baby. Like in the I think what America is having trouble figuring out or squaring, and maybe it always has, it's part of the code, is oscillating from two different parties it's like being with someone who's schizophrenic.
Yeah.
And the periods where you get, a Democrat for 8 years and then a Republican for 8 years, it's with this whiplash constantly. I mean, how do you have a relationship with someone like that, right? Like, how do you? And the Iranians, they realize this too. I've been, going through their history recently. Obviously, I keep bringing them up.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the UK was the ones who started the keep Iran not from democratizing. This is like 100-year-old strategy for the UK because the UK really needed that oil. And this is like World War I on. They were like, Iran, we're going to exploit the shit out of them if we can. And at first,
Yep.
the leaders were like, yeah, sure, take it, whatever, 80-20. Okay, I guess that sounds good. It was ridiculous. Like, it took Reza Shah to show up and be like, what the fuck is going on? You guys are just, why do we have a Persian oil company?
Yeah.
What are they doing for us? We know how to do all this shit. It's not like they came and built it. We built it here with them.
Yeah.
And then we're just giving them 50% of this shit. Yeah. So he shuts it down. This is a problem for the Brits. And the Brits go to Truman and they're like, hey, they shut down our embassy. So we can't overthrow their government anymore. In case the people didn't know, and I didn't know this either, an embassy on foreign ground is considered the country of the embassy's ground. So, for instance, if there's a U.S. embassy in Iran, like there was at the time of Reza Shah, then that is sacred U.S. ground. If, like, unauthorized Persians go onto that ground, they're trespassing on U.S. territory. That's how this works. It's sovereign ground. So it also serves as a place where countries put all their spies. Like, just this is if you didn't know, this is how it works. Like when the U.S. shut its embassy down in Iran because the cat was out of the bag and a whole bunch of angry citizens were going to go uncover the truth about the U.S. trying to overthrow their democracy in '53, which they did under Eisenhower. All the embassy people who were working in the embassy were gone. There was like 4 people. They had exited over to the Canadian embassy at the time. This is, the Iran hostage crisis came from this. There were 64 people at the embassy. They were all people working for the CIA, and they were all shredding documents that were saying, like, yeah, we did a coup to overthrow the democracy in Iran. So backing up to this, the Brits wanted this to happen. Truman said no. Not because he's like mega principled. Truman was pretty awesome. Truman said no because we had done it in Syria 3 years before and it went terrible. And so Truman's like, yeah, we don't do that, anymore. He said, America doesn't do that. And then under his breath is like, anymore. Like, we don't do it again. Eisenhower did say yes to it though. And so they did manage to overthrow the democracy. And that's when the Shah took over as the monarch because he realized, the U.S. and the U.K. aren't going to let us be a democracy. So we tried. It's not going to happen maybe in 20 years. Funny enough, Jimmy Carter tries to force it on the Shah 20 years later, which leads to the Shah being overthrown essentially. And this is why Persians hate Jimmy Carter.
Right.
Yeah. So specifically, they hate Jimmy Carter and they're always distrustful of the Democrats, unironically. Maybe they hate Trump too, but whatever.
One of the things that I don't have the resource right in front of me right now. I'm going to speak extemporaneously about something that I think needs maybe a little more attention, and that is the way that in the Vietnam era, protests in university campuses were kind of like peas and carrots.
Yeah.
Right there was a lot of activity going on university campuses because that population of people had sort of the most um, well, the energy and the understanding of what was going on, and that's where a lot of this turmoil was happening. And it's it's through a series of machinations, and I think we could point to the Reagan governorship as being an origin of this, that
Yeah.
that um, a university education right now is pretty expensive, and it's expensive for a litany of reasons, not least of which, if you make it a um, life changing amount of debt that you'll go into to get an education, it removes some of your fervor for protesting other things that the US government is doing. And there's a connection, there's a tie in between the Vietnam era student protests around the war
Hmm.
and the way that um, a university education has cost more and more every year since then.
Yeah. Hmm.
And it has a lot to do with the decoupling of what the state was willing to pay for versus what the burden on the individual to pay for.
Yeah.
And I I know that you could make a lot of assumptions about what that might do to a culture if you um, put some divisions or put some divisive qualities to higher education. But if you look at the way that the American public vocally, vocally uh, makes it clear how they understand anything from scientific information to how their political system works to how just anything works. The Americans are vocal about their ignorance in these things. They don't mind telling anyone around them how little they know about how any of this works.
And how
And it
sure
comes
they are of their decisions despite not knowing anything. It's
exactly.
a weird, profound proudness to be like,
Yeah,
well, I don't follow politics at all, but I will never vote for the third person who has my best interest in mind because I'm retarded.
precisely. And boy, are we proud as a nation of this. I was going to put a marker on that, but I think I'll move on. We are so proud of the things that we choose to do in the fog of ignorance, and it's not. I'm not trying to say, oh, if an entire nation, if a nation is completely populated by people with a baccalaureate education from a college, that it's going to be necessarily better in every way. I'm not saying that, but what I am saying is that we have worked really hard to undermine public knowledge of what has become a very sophisticated civilization technologically, how our civilization is set up and organized, in other words, the polity of our civilization.
Yeah.
We are vastly ignorant in how um, our neurobiology affects the nation more broadly. Like an individual's neurobiology has this profound effect on the country as a whole. We just are ignorant of these things, and it doesn't take long to figure out that we are not only ignorant but hostile to how um, our bodies work. We are just absolutely enthusiastic about not being clear on an understanding of how the human body of both sexes work. We just can't tolerate knowing that thing. So that shows up in our politics and how we organize our civilization.
Yeah. I
And
mean,
I wanted
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I wanted to tie the situation of the Vietnam War era and the public turmoil that was going on during that time to what we're seeing now as what looks like a box of mice that were just dumped out and we're just kind of scurrying around confused. And the decisions that we make in our polity that reflect on that time in our history, because now when you ask Americans, well, why would you choose this political candidate over this political candidate? Well, they have justifications, but those justifications are never steeped in, oh,
They're
I
not grounded
understand
in reality. That I mean,
right,
at the end of the day,
exactly.
they're not even grounded in reality. And I mean, like,
That's exactly what I'm getting at.
yeah, um,
The,
it's probably by design at this point, right? Social
yeah,
manipulation. The
totally.
internet right now is being used as a weapon. It's
Mm-hmm.
being weaponized, obviously, because
Mm-hmm.
any form of communication can be weaponized, especially new forms of communication. We talked
Yep.
about Joseph Goebbels um, doing this, right? He was a
Mm-hmm.
master of understanding marketing and the radio, the power of the radio. The
Yeah.
radio was the new tech on the forefront. Right now, it's
Mm-hmm.
social media. It's social media is the way that the newest way people communicate to each other, and it just so happens that social media platforms are extremely expensive. So only the richest people in the world control these platforms. So therefore, they are, and the richest people in the world own most of the news media organizations now. So these people are manipulating the information we're allowed to see. And
Mm-hmm.
in fact, now they've found ways to algorithmically feed us information that will create behavioral change within our society. So none of that behavioral manipulation is new. The tools at which they're doing it to us is new.
Right.
It might be more sophisticated. The
Mm-hmm.
comp right now, I think socially manipulating this is a lot more complex. And so there's a cup. It's like there's phases to having to do this. If you want to control a population, I think, and I'm thinking about like, okay, so Elon and the elites who support Elon. There's probably a shit ton of billionaires right now who are fully on board for what he is doing, or at least what Donald Trump's doing, because they know at the end of the day, the amount a tax cut can enrich a multi-billion dollar or multi-trillion dollar company like Apple, or the CEOs and the people who own these companies, who own most of the stock in the world. 5, 10, 15% tax cuts are unfathomable amounts of wealth over the next 10 years for that company.
Right.
Unfathomable. We're talking, it's we can't even imagine. I mean, Jeff Bezos was the richest man in the world in like 2013 with like $120 billion, right? And now like Elon Musk is almost a trillionaire, and it's been 10 years, right? So like that's the kind of wealth that a tax cut in 2018 can do
Mm-hmm.
in 6
Mm-hmm.
years. That's the effect of where we're at right now. The tax cut is still enriching the wealth. Um, to socially manipulate us, there's a lot of things that have to happen. I think it's funny I mean, it's interesting you brought up Vietnam. Imagine you're the boys you went to high school with and your friends and every male classmate you have who potentially could have gone to college with you. Maybe they were going to be your lover or whatever, gets their number called to go to Vietnam. I mean, it's incredible. You had a large portion of women going to college for the first time in the 60s and 70s, right? During this
Mm-hmm.
period of time. And they were probably feeling like all the boys numbers like people were being called away and being killed, and the men of their generation were coming back broken. Um,
Yeah.
Imagine how much my mom was one of those people in Washington D.C. protesting, right? Like she was a
Mm-hmm.
college, uh, she was a university student at the time, protesting the war as
Mm-hmm.
well. So I think that's interesting. And why I bring that up is I think that the Me Too movement, along with Occupy Wall Street, which I think these movements really made some decisions within the rich's heads of how they needed to actually tamp down and control. Now,
Yep.
the rich will always side with the Republicans, the conservative side, because that's how you save your money. So if you don't know
Right.
that most rich people, they'll side with the Republican side um, to conserve their wealth, go figure, and to make it more. And so if everything is in service of doing that, a college educated woman population, which is the majority, the people who are getting mostly college education over the last 20 years have been the women population. They're catching up.
Mm-hmm.
And it's no surprise that they're voting blue and Democratic. It's weird. It's like their rights are tied to doing it, right? Their ability to have these rights are tied to doing it. And with the SAVE Act and all these new legislations that the Republicans are putting forward right now, the SAVE Act, what it does, if you didn't know, it's a Trojan horse bill like all of their bills are right now. So what it's doing is on its surface, it's being designed to go after the trans and the same-sex marriages,
Mm-hmm.
lesbians specifically, because if you take if your surname, whatever your name is now, if you've changed it and it's not, and you go to vote and it's not the same as your birth certificate name, you are not allowed to vote. That's what the SAVE Act will do, and it will save Republican states from being voted blue because it'll stop a bunch of trans, which barely exists. So it's not like they were going to turn it state blue. We're talking about 0.00009% of the population. And the lesbian communities, I'm sorry, it's just not big enough in a red state to really turn the dive. But what it will do, and what they will actually use it to do, is to disenfranchise the vote of, I don't know, 69 million women who are married to their husbands and have taken their name. This is how you can stop their voting. Or they'll make it so that the husband has to authorize that she votes or something like that. I don't know. Maybe they'll put some little filter where, they'll allow the husband, because he's the head of the household, and we're going back to where the Christian values change the hierarchy structures. So I see a lot of this as social manipulation, like you said. I'm yes-anding, and similar to Vietnam, I think that the female population of voters in college are the target. I think right now we're seeing a concerted effort to go after the female populations. I'm concerned right now that Elon Musk is pillaging our data right now, our federal data, including illegally your and my veteran data, which is legally protected by federal laws and statutes. There are lawsuits that are attacking him for this, but we know that the legal system is compromised now, and nothing will come of this. So just so you know, if you're a veteran, your data has now been accessed and unauthorized illegally. I imagine this will be used. I don't really have to imagine much. Larry Ellison said that we are already in the process. AI will be a great tool at keeping the public on their best behavior. I think it was the exact quote of what Larry Ellison said. Larry Ellison is the second richest man in the world right now. He's a creepy boomer that dates like 20-year-olds, whatever. That's the least offensive thing about him, to be honest. Right now, I feel like Elon will most likely use our data to train some AI model for the U.S. government, and they'll roll it out as a tool to go after illegal immigrants at first.
Right. First, they came after the illegal immigrants, and I did nothing. This is
Well,
the
it,
pattern.
it's totally easy. I mean,
Yeah.
half of the country will be like, "That's what I voted for. Good, yay!" And then, we know what
Yeah.
it'll be used for. Just similarly to the Trojan horse bill of going after trans and lesbian couples. Maybe gay men are also taking each other's names, so they could go after them as well if that's common. I'm not up on specifically gay men's marriage culture last name taking scenario right now, so I'm not privy to that. I'd need to talk to any of my gay friends married. Yes, my godfather's married. I'd have to talk to him about it. Curious. I don't think they took each other's last name. Anyways, so these Trojan horse bills are there. They're going to be used and expanded. Bills are expanded and all the time, or they're interpreted based on language and used and they evolve. That's how they work. They don't just stay static for, this was the purpose of that bill and it's just used for that purpose all the time. They're written super specific if they want that bill to be specifically used for a purpose. They'll use extremely specific language. So I don't know where I'm going with this. These are all just feel like these are like blatant, these are all forms of social control that are designed to disenfranchise us and take away our freedoms, frankly. So
Yeah. When we began this conversation, we were, I suppose, musing about what it is about this country that's worth preserving. What it is about this country that's worth pushing back against this type of
yeah.
Really just, well, I mean, the good news is that at least the part of the iceberg that we see is just really obvious and blatant. So there's a lot of it that's very clearly an attack on our civil liberties, on anything to do that with with what made our country a place, a decent place to live in, despite some of those historical things that we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And what what we're also kind of the point we're kind of getting at here is, so yes, the question of, well, what is there to defend? Well, what there is to defend is a system that when it's when we fully participate in it, we can actually make for ourselves a much better existence than is going to be delved out to us by an authoritarian. What we have recently allowed to happen is a reorganization of our civilization so that women have less autonomy, less say in the way that our civilization is organized and operated, the polity,
Yeah.
and less. Did I already say this? I said autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
Literally, their rights to their own bodies are being stolen out from under them,
Yeah.
and that is a very big problem in general for liberty and freedom and the things that we talk about as being ideals of Americanism.
Did I tell you the story of uh, Christmas, like the story of Coca-Cola and Christmas? Do you know the story of why Christmas is so big in America?
I I went to hear this, and I should point out that my clock says we've been at this for 56 minutes.
We have, and that's why I'm gonna end it on this because I'm gonna tie it into the theme. So I'm gonna tell the story after I say what the theme is right now, just so the people who are still listening to our last 4 minutes and like and subscribe if you are, and share us to other people, please. Thank you. I'm gonna leave with this story, and it's to say that history is not just happening around us. As despite how small and insignificant us ants among the colony are, you're a part of history. History is happening. People are making history happening, and it doesn't just happen around us. People do things. Actions have consequences, and the wheel of history rolls on, and these things have an impact on how bumpy that road is. So real quickly, Coca-Cola 100 years ago, after they stopped putting cocaine in it, but soon after they stopped putting cocaine in it, were looking at their sales, and they were realizing that they were selling in the summer a lot, and that their sales would just drop off in the winter, like dead. And it was just because people didn't think of Coca-Cola as a winter drink, right? They're like, oh, cold, refreshing, all this stuff. And so what Coca-Cola thought is like, okay, they started investigating in saints that were going to be decommissioned first, because little marketing team, right? And they found Saint Nicholas. He was about to be decommissioned from the Catholic Church, right? And I don't know what decommissioning is. We don't have to get into all of that. But basically, the Catholics are like, you're going to stop looking at him as a saint. He's been reliquated to the past or something. So anyways, that means he's fair game for public use, I guess, or something. And Coca-Cola is like, okay, we'll grab Saint Nick. He was a young saint. So this is funny. And then they were like, okay, and they were like mixing him with this old German. Oh, so they found Saint Nick because they first were like, okay, we need this. They had this German chimney sweep guy who was a character who robbed people. He was a chimney sweep who would go down your chimney, rob people, but when he'd leave with all your shit, he would clean your chimney. And so that was like his thing. So they merged Saint Nick and what's his name? The other Chris Kringle. Chris Kringle was the robber guy. They mixed them together, and you get Saint Nicholas Chris Kringle. You get Santa Claus. They made him fat and old. He was fat because the one cleaning the chimneys was fat. They made him old because he could have a white beard, and he would be. They wanted to use all red and white colors because that was Coca-Cola colors. So red and white being Christmassy colors is because of Coca-Cola, not because of like Jesus was like red and white, when he came out of the womb or something. I mean, he probably was. Oh, he didn't come out of the womb. I mean, whoops, my bad. Whoa. Oh, he wasn't, a twin brother or anything. His brother wasn't Judas, like his actual brother wasn't Judas, and he didn't have two other siblings. But we'll keep with. Oh, sorry, if we're just telling myths. So that's the story. So Coca-Cola, to sell Coke in the winter time, invented Santa Claus. And by the way, if you didn't know, when they were doing this to Christmas. No one gave a shit because Christmas was not the popular Christian holiday like it is now. It was not the main holiday that everyone was like, oh, if you're a Christian, you have to celebrate Christmas. It was Easter. Because frankly, 120 years ago, if you were telling the story of baby Jesus, it's like, cool, a baby was born, I guess, immaculate conception, whatever, kind of cool, but it's still kind of boring. A dude dying and being murdered and then brought back from the dead 3 days from now that's crazy. Yeah. So that's why Easter was the big deal. So Christians didn't really give a shit that Coke was fucking with Coca-Cola at the time, but they did. And now Christmas is one of the biggest spending times of commercialism across the country and the world. It is a global phenomenon and holiday. So it affects GDP. It affects slogans in our politics. We have Trump ran on bringing Christmas back for the love of God, right? Because it's so important, because Coca-Cola made it so important, not because you're a good Christian. So that is to say that we are part of history. Things happen, decisions are made, and history happens. And it's amazing the butterfly wings of two dudes messing around with Coca-Cola back when it was a $10,000 company or some shit. And, now it's a multi-billion-dollar Mormon-owned enterprise. So
you can't travel the globe without encountering something to do with that brand.
Yeah.
Either find the product itself or the advertisement of said product.
So that's my final story, is that history's happening. We're in history right now, and you might not think you're affecting it, but you might be. And we're not just NPCs like these billionaires think that we are. So anyways, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Richard.
Likewise.
We'll do it again. Talk to you all later.
See you next time, Pierce.
Adios.